Okay, Bismillah. And tells this message, see the Hamza, because he's self-quarantined. Okay. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa afdalu as-salati wa atammu at-taslim ala Sayyidina wa Nabina Muhammad al-mab'uthi rahmatan wa nuran lil alameen. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وارزقنا إيمانا كاملا ويقينا صادقا وشفاء من كل داء. Alhamdulillah. We have reached line number 24 in our study of Imam Sawi's Sharh on Jawhara al-Tawhid. And this is on al-Mukhalafa lil-Hawadith, of Allah's absolute distinctness from created things. Right? At-Tanzih. Right? So he says, Imam Laqqani says in the Jawhara itself, وَأَنَّهُ لِمَا يَنَالُ الْعَدَمُ مُخَالِفٌ بُرْهَانُ هَذَا الْقِدَمُ. And he is absolutely distinct for all that is susceptible to non-being. The proof of that is his being beginninglessness, his being beginningless. وَأَنَّهُ لِمَا يَنَالُ الْعَدَمُ. And he, Allah Most High, is absolutely distinct from those things that accept non-existence, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is absolutely distinct from originated things. Right? The dalil al-naqli for this is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling us in the Quran, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. There is nothing like unto him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us in the Quran explicitly, وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٍ. And many other related texts. Right? Direct and indirect. Right? And so there's explicit texts about the tanzih of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just spelling it out, bil-ibara, right? Like these two that we've mentioned. لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِ شَيْءٍ وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٍ. And then there are others where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes himself and tells us about his distinctness. Right? Right? By the many names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that affirm his distinctness. And there's a beautiful work by one of the great Mughtarib Damascus scholars, Shaykh Abdul Rahman ibn Hassan Habannaka, rahimahullah, his work al-Aqidah al-Islamiyya. He has a beautiful section. We can share the PDF of al-Aqidah al-Islamiyya. It's floating online. And it's large work. The Shaykh was concerned that people don't get things. So sometimes, he is on the detailed side of presentation. So his books look like bricks. But he writes very clearly, and you can skim it too, right? But he makes things very clear. He writes beautifully, mashallah. He did some amazing khidmah, and partly because he was in ghurba, because he was living out of, he had to leave Syria. So his books, though very, very, very popular within Syria amongst the ulama, etc., but overseas, a lot of the ulama being in, whether those who are in Saudi or in the Gulf, they don't have a public presence. So outside of their existing circles of influence, they're not sometimes as appreciated. But that does not say anything about the greatness of their knowledge. And Shaykh Abdul Rahman Habannaka is certainly one of these. His father, Shaykh Hassan Habannaka was one of the great revivers of, of Islamic knowledge in Damascus in the middle of the 20th century, at a time at a time when things were extraordinarily difficult due to so many things. So anyways, what Shaykh Abdurrahman Habannaka does in this work is that he looks at the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and what are the divine names that relate to these attributes. So he looks at the 99 names and he brings them back to these sifat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That section, and others have talked about it too. I mean, this same thing is discussed by many of the people who talked about the 99 names of Allah. Imam al-Ghazali mentions it ijmalan, but he breaks it down and in a very, very clear and well-arranged way. And that's something you'd find a lot of benefit in, but also this helps us reflect. Because when you recite the Quran, Allah is subhanahu wa ta'ala is not only telling us about His attributes, one is bil ibara, He tells us, A is B. Inna Allaha ala kulli shay'in qadir. Right? What's the point of studying Qudra? That when you read that, you're like, okay, no. Inna Allah ala kulli shay'in qadir. Right? Allah's Qudra تتعلق بكل ممكن. Right? إيجادا. Right? Right? According to the Asharis. Sorry, I put that. I've been reading a lot of Maturidi stuff recently. I have to we're explaining this. على وجهه إن شاء الله. With that, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He tells us about His names, He is Al-Quddus, As-Salam. Right? These are names of transcendence. Right? They are names of transcendence whose primary madlul is tanzih. Right? Is his transcendence beyond the attributes of created things. Right? Like Al-Quddus. And amongst those, depends how you define salam, but as-salam is one of them. And others. Then there are things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about creation, that tells us about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's, right? So there's explicit statements of tanzih, then there's Allah telling us about Himself, His names, right? For example, affirming His tanzih. And there is what He tells us about creation in general, or us in particular, that affirm tanzih. Right? And we don't want to go too much into this, but amongst that, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling us in Surah Fatir, Ya ayyuhan nas antumul fuqara'u ila Allah. O people, you are the ones in absolute need of Allah. Right? But the ibarat al-nas, the text is telling us about the iftiqar of people to Allah. Right? But now, what do people have that the stone doesn't have? But the most specific wasf. Yeah, well, choice, right? So so all these are true. The aql, the choice, but choice. So if those who have choice are muftaqir ila Allah, then those who don't have choice, a fortiori, so this bidilalat al-nas, that if human beings, right, are antum al-fuqara ila, your identity, this A is B, your identity is iftiqar ila Allah, then, and you have, لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ, and by granting them intellect, by granting them choice, through that intellect, and the two, إِنَّا عَرَضْنَا الْأَمَانَةَ, right? If they are muftaqir, then what about hayawanat? They don't have that particular karama of the al-aql al-mumayyiz, right? Or al-aql al-taklifi. right? Al-aql al-taklifi, right? And let alone other things. So everything falls under that verse, right? By its dilala. But then so many other verses, right? Right? Ikhtilaf, right? As we took in the Kharida, right? The fact that things change tells us about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Which goes back to the issue of qidam, right? Because ma yanalu al-adam, what is its quality? What is its wujud? Is mumkin, right? It's mumkin. Al-wujud al-mumkin is muqayyad. Is muqayyad. The possible existence is limited by time, limited by space, and anything that is affirmed for it is limited. Al-wujud al-wajib is absolute. Right? Munazzahun ala al-itlaqi wa taqid. He is transcendent beyond even your affirmation of transcendence. Okay? Right? Ma qadarullaha haqqa qadri. They do not esteem Allah as He deserves to be esteemed. So, there is no point of comparison, right? And that He is, with respect to that which is given to non-existence, meaning which is al-mumkin, right? Al-mumkin, mukhalifun. He is absolutely distinct. He is distinct. Of course, something in Arabic, the dhamir goes back to what? A dhamir goes back to the that, not to a sifa. Okay? Right? If I'm talking about Zayd and say, huwa طيب, and say, كنت أقصد طبخه طيب. No, but if we're talking about Zayd, right? The asl of the dhamir is that goes back to the that. Unless you're talking about the sifa or the fi'l or whatever, right? The asl. I mean, of course, there's other usage. أنه أي Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala مخالف. So Allah Himself is completely مخالف. فمن باب أولى, a fortiori, He is مخالف في ذاته, and therefore في صفاته and في أفعاله. Right? So Allah's mukhalafa in His that, His entity is absolutely distinct from the entity of created things. His attributes are absolutely distinct from the attributes of created things. And His actions are absolutely distinct. So His mukhalafa lil hawadith is dhatan, because His that is wajib al-wujud and mutlaq, right? And ghani. And His entity is necessary existent, absolute, and independent. The that of anything else is mumkin al-wujud, muqayyad, and muftaqir. It's limited. Anything you can affirm for anything created is limited. Right? Of course, with wisdom, right? You don't go tell someone, well, you need to use the toilet too. Right? There's adab. Right? Adab with the common person. You don't go to shopkeeper and say, how much toilet paper do you use? Because it's not min muqtadayat al-adab to talk about ذكر ما يستقبح قبيح. Likewise, that doesn't mean we go around. We don't do it to common people, and that's part of the su' adab. And of course, the su' faham of some of those attitudinally divergent. That yes, there's no, as the poet said, that الرب رب والعبد عبد والعبد عبد في كل حال. The Lord is always the Lord and the servant is always a servant, regardless who they are. But that ثوب الأدب والتعظيم لا يخلع. That's of the many objections to our literalist brethren when it comes to talking about the Prophet ﷺ, etc. Okay, so he says, قال الشارح الإمام أحمد الدردير رحمه الله تعالى أن بفتح الهمزة وأنه هي واسمها وخبرها خبر لمبتدأ محذوف. Right? So this مبتدأ محذوف تقديره والصفة الثالثة أنه. Right? Now this is one possible i'rab. There's a more direct i'rab of what is the taqdeer. Right? Right? Which is, because it says وَوَاجِبٌ لَهُ الْوُجُودُ وَالْقِدَمُ كَذَا بَقَاءٌ. So that's the mubtada, وَوَاجِبٌ. Right? Right? Or that it's ma'tuf in it on wujud. فَوَاجِبٌ لَهُ, wajibun is the fa there, separates from what's before it. It has a particular name, this fa. Wajibun is mubtada. واجب له الوجود is خبر والقدم معطوف كذا بقاء معطوف وأنه لما يخال this all of this جملة right, is in عطف to that, right? And you can see how, and that's a more direct analysis. And in general, if you're asked, how do you do something, right? If someone's like, how do I heat this bread? So put it in the toaster, press on. That's a much better description than saying, well, first take the bread out of the fridge, then do this, then do, because it's understood. How do I heat the bread? It's assumed that you have the bread and you're talking about this toaster, right? So you don't need to take unnecessary steps. Right? Okay. وهو حرف توكيد ونصب. يعني أن is حرف of توكيد and نصب. Right? It emphasizes and puts something in نصب. Right? والهاء اسمها. والهاء اسمها. Right? ومخالف خبرها. So this is the grammar of it. ولما ينال متعلق بمخالف. And because the والعائد محذوف أي لما يناله, right? Because you need to connect these dependent statements. وهذه, so he does the i'rab for us just to clarify, and also this i'rab is done that, okay, are you thinking grammatically? You just read something, did you think about it grammatically? If you didn't, then please do so. وهذه هي الصفة الثالثة من صفات السلوب. The third attribute of the attributes of negation, called صفات السلوب or الصفات السلبية. والمعنى أن ذاته وصفاته تعالى مخالفة لكل حادث. And the meaning is that his entity and his attributes are absolutely distinct to every originated thing. والمخالفة لما ذكر عبارة عن سلب الجرمية والعرضية والكلية والجزئية ولوازمها عنه تعالى. Right? So this distinctness that has been mentioned is an expression, it expresses a negation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being a jirm, right, being a body, or being an accident, meaning being attributes, being a category, kulliya, like, or a part of a category, juz'iyya, and anything that they entail, right? So all of these, because all of these are from the from the characteristics of originated things. Now, one can add, of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is absolutely distinct in his dhat and sifat and his af'al, right? Wa af'alihi, right? Because the fi'l of Allah is kun, ijad, right? The fi'l of created things is simply, ikhtiyarun wa kasb. That's it. Our choices and acquisition of responsibility. That's it. So there's no point of comparison between Allah's fi'l and our af'al. Right? وَإِنَّمَا وَجَبَ لَهُ مَا ذُكِرْ, and what is mentioned is necessary for him لِأَنَّ الْحَوَادِث, because originated things, right? الحادث هو الممكن الموجود. It's the possible that comes into existence. Right? Right? إما جواهر أو أعراض. They are either essences or attributes. Right? And these have technical names in English. You don't need to worry about it. أو أزمنة أو أمكنة, or originated things are either essences or the attributes of essences, or they are time, which is a relationship between originated things, or places, أو جهات, or a direction, right, left, right? And these are all nisab. These are all relationships, right? Azmina, etc. These are relationships. أو حدود, or limits. This is the end of his territory. The end, what is it? It's not a thing, it's a nisbah between A and B, right? ولا شيء منها بواجب الوجود, and none of them are necessary existence. لما ثبت لها من الحدوث, because of what's affirmed for them of originatedness. وكل, and we have already taken وكل من جاز عليه العدم عليه قطعا يستحيل القدم, and anything that accepts not being, right? So things either clearly have a beginning, so they're originated, so they're ممكن الوجود. And the awsaf al-imkan apply to them, right? Which are three. That anything possible that exists is, we have to always remember, it's ممكن الوجود, it's muqayyad, and it is muftaqir. Wajib al-wujud, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is wajib al-wujud, mutlaq, ghani. So there's no point of comparison between that, right? Right? لما ثبت لها من الحدوث واستحالة القدم عليها, and the absurdity of affirming that it is eternal. Right? وقد تسمح رضي الله تعالى عنه في التعبير عن الصفة بقوله وأنه لما ينال العدم مخالف. Right? So he used an expansive expression. He says Allah is distinct. Right? Whereas these لأن الصفة هي مخالفته تعالى للحوادث. Because the attribute itself is Allah's distinctness to originated things. والمؤدى واحد. Right? Right? He is distinct. The attribute itself is distinctness. Because we don't say, because that's the difference between a name and an attribute. So for example, if we say, he is, we're talking about Allah's attributes, he say, so he is the powerful. Powerful, the powerful is not his attribute. What is his attribute? Power. فهو القادر. المخالف, that is like an ism, whereas the attribute itself is al-qudra, right? And of course, a name and an attribute are interrelated, because the attribute is the meaning itself that the entity possesses. يعني المعنى القائم بالذات. That is a sifa, right? The ism is the name is what you call the entity that possesses that a particular attribute, right? So for example, the sifa is rahma, right? Rahma. Allah is ar-Rahman, يعني الرحمن هو عبارة عن الذات المتصفة بالرحمة. right? العليم الذات المتصفة بصفة العلم. and you can say على وجه يعني المبالغة. right? عليم like from the fa'il pattern, etc. Anyways. برهان هذا القدم. The proof of this is Allah's being beginningless. right? يصح أن يكون برهان مبتدأ والقدم خبره والمعنى. So برهان can be the مبتدأ and the قدم can be خبر. يصح because there's other ways of making إعراب of it. والمعنى برهان المخالفة للحوادث نفس القدم. Meaning that the proof of Allah being distinct from created things is the same proof as the proof for either the same thing as qidam, that he is eternal, therefore he must be distinct. Or it is the proof of qidam, as we'll see. وَهُوَ قَدْ ثَبَتَ دَلِيلُهُ. And we've taken the proof of qidam. So given that he is eternal, because everything else must be originated. So that's it. So there's no point of comparison. ويصح أن يكون الكلام على حذف مضاف تقديره دليل القدم. The other way is that the proof of Allah being distinct from creation is the same proof as the proof for Allah being qadim, being beginningless. وتقديره أن تقول, and this proof would be that you say الله تعالى مخالف للحوادث. Allah Most High is distinct from creation. إذ لو لم يكن مخالفا لها لكان مماثلا. Because if he weren't distinct from them, he would be like them. لعدم الواسطة, because there's only two possibilities. You can either be like something or different or distinct. There's no intermediate state. If you're somewhat like, then you're like it. Because likeness, مماثلة doesn't have to be من كل وجه. Right? Being like something does not have to be completely. Could just be in some attributes and not the others. لكن مماثلته تعالى للحوادث باطلة. But his being like originated things is absurd. إذ لو ماثل شيئا منها لكان حادثا مثلها. Because if he were like anything originated, he would be originated like it. لكن كونه حادثا باطل. But his being originated is absurd. إذ لو كان حادثا لافتقر إلى محدث. Because if he were originated, he would be in need of an originator. لكن افتقاره باطل. But his being in need is absurd. Because he is, and it goes back to those three. He is necessary, existent, absolute, independent. لما تقدم. Because of what we've taken. Line 25. قيامه بالنفس وحدانية منزها أوصافه سنية. Right? قيامه بالنفس. Right? His independence. And this is generally, they use this term for terminological purposes. Right? Some of the ulama use the term al-istighna. His being absolutely independent. And some use that because that's come in the Quran. Allah being al-Ghani has come in the Quran. But this is used, when they use terminology, one of the purposes of terminology is to delineate the meaning. Because ghina has a broad range of meanings. There's a particular meaning that is meant in Revelation, right? Ghina al-mutlaq. That's why some scholars call this attribute al-ghina al-mutlaq. Right? There's also the madlul of his being as-samad, for example. Right? But samad as well, in the Arabic language, is a range of meanings. So the ulama use this terminology to help us navigate the primary texts, right? قوله قيامه بالنفس. المراد بالنفس الذات. Right? يعني what's meant by nafs here, like his, you can say, his self-subsistence. By self, what's meant is his entity. Right? Now, before we go into, so قيامه بالنفس affirms, has two negations. عدم افتقاره إلى محل أو مخصص. Right? He does not need an entity. محل أي ذات يقوم بها. Right? So we'll see that. So he does not need an entity to exist through, nor does he need an originator. And he is independent, so he does not need an entity to exist through. Right? So, so he's not in a place, because if he is necessarily on a throne, Allah is in need of the throne. Right? So what happens is, if the throne goes, that's absurd. Right? Nor is he an attribute. Right? And we would go quite far if we went into refutation of Christianity, but قيامه بالنفس negates Christian beliefs, and this is part of what is the madlulat of Surah al-Ikhlas. فعبارة عن استغنائه عن المحل أي ذات يقوم بها أو مخصص أي موجد, or a specifier meaning an originator. Right? And these are implications of being واجب الوجود. Right? قيامه بالنفس, and this is what's affirmed by Allah being al-Qayyum, Allah being القائم بنفسه المقيم لغيره. Right? From which his istighna, Allah being al-Ghani, Allah being الصمد, Allah being the independent. من يصمد إليه في الحوائج ولا حاجة له. Right? أي من يصمد إليه كل موجود سواه. Right? في كل حاجة. من وجود, من إيجاد وإمداد وما عداها. Right? The one whom all existent things besides him turn to in absolute neediness for every need, including their being originated and their being sustained, and all derivative needs. Right? ولا حاجة له أبدا, and he has no need whatsoever. Right? As-Samad. Right? So these are all now what does قيامه بالنفس, this ba, what kind of ba is it? واختلف في معنى الباء هذه فقيل للآلة وقيل للسببية وقيل بمعنى في وهو الأقرب. So there's a few opinions between the commentators of that is this ba instrumental للآلة, right? أو للسببية قيامه بسبب نفسه. Right? Now the sababiyya, each, there's grammatical challenges, and that in general grammar describes created things. So how do you talk about Allah using created language? You have to appreciate that مع التنزيه. مع التنزيه. You say قال الله تعالى, يقول الله تعالى. Right? 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 Both the madi and the mudari' don't relate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So we say them with tanzih. وقيل بمعنى في, and said meaning في قيامه في نفسه. Right? هو الأقرب, and there's the اختلاف of al-Amir in his حاشية on إتحاف المريد. So he says في is الأقرب. وقد اقتصر عليه الملوي في حاشيته. الملوي was very impressive Azhari scholar from the 12th Islamic century. And he also has some, important works on Idah al-Mubham, on the Sulam in Mantiq. So, والمعنى, and the meaning, أنه مستغن في نفسه ليس باعتبار شيء آخر. That Allah is in Himself independent, not independent with consideration of something else. Because let's say, Zubayr was being supported by his father, but then he got married and he got a job. So now he's independent, but he's independent on the basis of his job, right? He's not absolutely independent, right? Right? But even if, let's say someone could do everything, but they can only do it by the attributes that they have or by the fact that there's things there. So let's say somebody is like a super survivalist. So you put them in the jungle, they know how to purify water, catch animals, build a fire, build a shelter, but they're still not independent. Why? Why aren't they independent? Because they need those things. They're independent if there is water, if there is food, if there is this. So that's bi'atibari shay'na. Allah's independence is absolute. Right? ويؤخذ من هذه الصفة جواز إطلاق النفس على الله تعالى. And from this attribute, right? Because this attribute, this naming was given by the ulama, who are a'imma of our deen. And of course, one thing is, and it's become fashionable, and in some cases it's actually particularly fashionable in the Arab world, right? People like saying wallah, and when I say wallah, it's like, they're going to say something absurd afterwards. And they'll say, how can you say something like this? Right? And you have to be polite with them, but like, do you know what qiyam means? No. Do you know what nafs means? Like really means? No. Then just stick with no. Right? But, and one has to be aware that people tend to have a lot of objections. But it's permitted to use the term nafs, self, with respect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَقَدْ وَرَدَ كَتَبَ رَبُّكُمْ عَلَى نَفْسِهِ الرَّحْمَةِ. Right? Allah has ordained upon Himself to have mercy. Right? Ar-Rahmanu ala al-arsh istawa. Right? The all-merciful. Allah chose to deal with creation on the basis of mercy. Right? Because, there's ijadu rahmatin, al-ijadu rahma. Right? Because the mumkin, the fact that the mumkin goes into existence, it's rahma, it's good for it. Because al-wujud khayrun min al-adam. So in that sense, even hell is mercy. Because it's better to be in hell than to be non-existent. Okay? That's of the numerous ways one can understand the eternity of hell. Yeah, you didn't have to exist. The fact that Nasallallahu al-afiyah, someone exists in hell is better than not existing. Right? And that's what Shaykh al-Akbar, he has very that at some point, and some people misquote that Shaykh al-Akbar says that hell is extinguished. He says the adhab is extinguished. Why? يَصِيرُ الْعَذَابُ عَذْبًا. At some point, the people of hell will finally recognize that this is from Allah. And they'll come to this realization. لكن نسأل الله لطائف الامتنان. يا رب. وَاصْطَنَعْتُكَ لِنَفْسِي. Right? Right? So Allah has ascribed these in the various verses to Himself, right? And it's also come in hadith, right? وفي الحديث عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أنه قال لا أحصي ثناء عليك. I cannot encompass praise upon you. أنت كما أثنيت على نفسك. As you yourself have praised yourself. Right? So the term nafs has come. This hadith in Bukhari, for example, in Muslim. خلافا لمن يقول إنه لا يجوز إطلاقها. Contrary to the one who says you cannot ascribe nafs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Of course, nafs as it's affirmed for Allah is different from nafs that we describe to ourselves. And one of the reasons, because tahashiyan, those who said you can't, because the philosophers, one of the things they talk about, because philosophers try to understand reality unaidedly. So what is the self? Right? So they describe the self by the characteristics of the self, but they're talking about the originated self. But من لا يجوز إطلاقها على الله تعالى, right? إلا في مقام المشاكلة. So he said this is mushakala. Mushakala is when Allah refers to Himself according to how we refer to ourselves, right? So the example from hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said, عليكم من العمل ما تطيقون فوالله لا يمل الله حتى تملوا. Right? Take from actions what you can sustain, for Allah does not tire until you do. This is mushakala. Does tiredness relate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? No, because tiredness is a taghayyur. What taghayyur? Change is a characteristic of created things. So it's min bab al-mushakala. Right? Well, the meaning is Allah does not tire, He's transcendent beyond tiring. This is mushakala. Bima dinta tudan. Right? As you are, so shall you find. Right? And there's many expressions of that. Right? And they took as proof مستدلا بقوله تعلم ما في نفس ما في نفسي ولا أعلم ما في نفسك. You know what's within myself and I don't know what's within yourself. Right? From Surah Al-Ma'idah, right? ومعنى استغنائه, of course, when you take summary, you don't have to go into things like this, right? They're just clarifying. ومعنى استغنائه المذكور, right? So here, note the istighna. Imam Sawi, right, uses the term one of the istighna. He used it within the definition, right? Within the definition. المعنى قيامه بالنفس معناه أنه مستغن في نفسه. Right? Right? And what's meant by his istighna? عدم افتقاره إلى محل أي ذات يقوم بها وإلى مخصص أي مؤثر. So what's meant by his independence is that he does not need a place to subsist through, meaning an entity by which he subsists. An entity could be, so Allah is not an attribute for something, nor does His entity, does Allah need something else to, so for example, okay, we can walk, but to walk we need not just leg, that's with, but we need ground. Right? We need, there's all these things that we need, right? So, وإلى مخصص أي مؤثر أي موجد. Imam al-Bajuri referred to it as موجد. Right? Right? عبد افتقاره إلى محل أو موجد. Right? So he says, so Allah Most High is absolutely independent, right? He does not need an originator. He does not need anything to be sustained, right? We need both an originator, we need both origination, and we need to be sustained, right? والحاصل أن القسمة رباعية. So the summary is that the demarcation is fourfold, says Imam Sawi. مستغن عن المحل والمخصص. So what's the mahal? أي ذات يقوم بها, and مخصص أي موجد, right? That there is the first category. So there, you know, with respect to neediness, dependence and independence, there's the one who is independent from both any entity, mahal, or an originator, a mukhassis, and وهو ذات الله تعالى, and that's the entity of Allah Himself. Second, مستغن عن المخصص فقط, that which is independent of an originator, وهو صفات الله تعالى. But صفات الله تعالى, we don't say that they are مفتقرة إلى ذاته, but we say هي قائمة بذاته. And we say they subsist by the entity of Allah, because they are واجبة في نفسها. Right? Right? So this is very important, right? Right? Here, قائمة بذاته. Right? As you see in the when we see the Sifat al-Ma'ani, you'll see that they, you know, and that's why in general, do not talk about Allah except as Allah has talked about Allah, His Messenger has talked about Allah, or the Imams of the Deen have talked about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even when you're explaining it to somebody, stick to what they say. Okay? And when in doubt, say less. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was asked by the Jews of Medina to describe Allah. He remained silent until revelation came. Okay? And that's caution. Right? Don't use your own words. Right? Right? And if you're not sure, it's a good question. You know, I could kind of use it. The talib ilm, use that as an opportunity too. Right? And that's why a lot of people, and especially in other languages, one has to be really careful. People say, nobody knows the mind of God. Can people say things like that? What do you mean by the mind of God? Right? Right? Nobody, you know, like, I'm doing God's will. Like, people say all kinds of really strange things that make no sense. Right? Have to be very careful. Right? Okay. ومفتقر للمخصص فقط وهو ذواتنا, and in need of a mukhassis, which is an originator only, and that is our entities. Now, this depends on how you define mukhassis, right? The mahal, how you define al-mahal, ذات يقوم بها. Here, because mahal meaning play, mahal can be either ذات يقوم بها, simply that we are not attributes. You are a that, and a that is متصفة بالصفة. Right? ومفتقر لهما, and that which is in need of both a mahal, a place, meaning ذات يقوم بها, and مخصص, and a specifier, وهو صفاتنا, and that's our attributes. والدليل على استغنائه عن المحل, and the proof that Allah Most High is independent of a mahal, of a place, meaning an entity which He subsists through. أن تقول لو احتاج إلى محل لكان صفة, that if He needed a place, He would be, by place they mean here ذات يقوم بها, that Allah. So this is that وَلِعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ, because this is just absurd, right? That if divinity were an attribute, were quality, right? It's one of the many arguments, and with all due respect to the people, we're just talking about the idea, right? Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi complains, I've never found people of less intellectual understanding than Christians. He said, whenever I've debated Christians, I've had to explain to them the first principles of reason first. And he would be debating like their ulama, right? Because no one would dare send someone to the likes of Al-Razi except someone of his, who they perceive to be, So this idea of divinity somehow being a quality, right? Which is why you could then ascribe, وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ, you could ascribe divinity to Christ, right? Right? This would be, so this relates to this. Like, we're not going to go into so إذ لو احتاج إلى محل كان صفة, that if he needed a place, he would be an attribute. ولو كان صفة, and if he were an attribute, لم يكن متصفا بصفات المعاني والمعنوية, that if he were an attribute, then he would not be characterized by the other attributes of meaning, right? والفرض أنه متصف بها, because each attribute is a meaning. So, for example, is knowledge power? Can knowledge be powerful? No. Knowledge is one thing, power is another. Right? Right? Power, right? Does knowledge create? No, because there's two separate things. And there's actually, this is a summary thing. There's a detailed rational proof, and if you dig, you can find it. That each, and we touched upon it actually in the dars of Sharh al-Kharida a little bit, that an attribute cannot have, you can describe an attribute. You can describe an attribute. You can say, we say things like knowledge is power. Right? Now, a theologian would cringe at that. That's poetry. Knowledge is power. No, knowledge is knowledge, power is power. Right? 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 People say things and you have to sort of say, okay, astaghfirullah, because you don't believe, because it's not true. Right? Knowledge is not power. Right? What they mean, knowledge is power, nisbatul al-fadil al-ma'ani, that if you have knowledge, that it's not, here, knowledge, it's not equal. Right? That power is not a sifa of knowledge, it's min lawazimihi. That if you have knowledge, then you would have power. Right? That's what's meant. It's an if-then statement. Right? And if you study mantiq, you could break it down. This is a type of conditional statement. If you have knowledge, then you have power. So knowledge is power. You sort of collapse multiple parts of a logical statement, right? But otherwise it's ridiculous, right? And even logically, someone's really knowledgeable, do they have any power? None, right? So even then, that's why ulama of mantiq are of the most troubled people. Say knowledge is power. Well, some knowledge may result in some kind of power, right? Because to say it absolutely is not true as well. Some knowledge is weakness. Right? If you realize who you are, who Allah is, you realize أَمَّا إِلَيْكُمْ سَادَتِي فَفَقِيرُ. Right? 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 Anyways. Right? If we understand that a sifa is a meaning, right? A sifa is a meaning, right? So knowledge. Right? Now you can describe the meaning, right? But can smell hear, for example? No, because they're two distinct things. والصفة الصفة لا تقوم بنفسها, right? إنما تقوم بالذات. والصفة لا تقوم بصفة. And an attribute does not subsist except through an entity. الصفة لا تقوم بالصفة. And you just think about, you look at the Sifat al-Ma'ani, you can describe the characteristics of the Sifa itself, right? So you can say, his knowledge is vast, his knowledge is deep, his knowledge is kada wa kada, right? So these are defining the meaning of that Sifa itself. But another meaning does not exist through that meaning. They're two separate things. And there's logical proofs for that, but that would take us very far. Right? So this is one line of reasoning, right? This is one line of reasoning, right? وَالْفَرَضْ أَنَّهُ مُتَّصِفٌ بِهَا, and the basis is that he is characterized by them. وَإِلَّا لَمَا وُجِدَ الْعَالَمِ. Otherwise, because Allah is characterized by attributes, otherwise the world would not have originated. فَبَطَلَ كَوْنُهُ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى صِفَةً. So therefore, Allah could not be an attribute. وَثَبَتَ كَوْنُهُ ذَاتًا. Now, why do they take this line of reasoning? Because there's other lines of reasoning to affirm his independence. You could say it goes back to his qidam. هو واجب الوجود وكل ما كان واجب الوجود فهو قائم بنفسه, because he is واجب الوجود, right? فهو قديم وغيره سبحانه وتعالى حادث, right? But so why complicate it and bring this in? Because amongst the reasons, تنوع في الدليل is to show the different types of proofs. Number one. Number two, because this hits on the issue of Christianity, right? Of Christianity, right? For example, the idea of divinity being a meaning divided amongst the Trinity. Because it's a meaning. Right? No. Right? That's why they're very careful to define what is al-ilah. Al-ilah. And that's why it's al-ilahu al-ma'bud. So yeah, we worship that meaning. Right? So that's why while saying al-ilahu al-ma'bud, and some of our attitudinally divergent brethren, they like sort of saying, the Ash'aris come up with this and come up with that and this and that, all this sort of propaganda. But simple thing is that, okay, Christians say, they also agree, al-ilahu al-ma'bud. Right? Because we worship this meaning. So they say the Father has the meaning, the Son has the meaning, and the Holy Ghost has this meaning, right? But what the Holy Ghost does in the Trinity is Allah knows best, right? But it's been jumlatil mustahil, so Allah knows the mustahilat, right? But that's the issue. So this proof, he's just sort of pointing towards it. This part of it is tashweeq. We want to give Shaykh Yusuf something to do during his break from. Is this we can discuss? We'll break this down a little bit further. Imam Dardir, if you look in Hashit al-Sawi on the Kharida, he goes into it a little bit. Right. The key is to understand why a sifa cannot have other sifat. Right? And that's a philosophical thing, but it is, of course, practically, people don't think, right? So it's good to know these things, right? And sometimes, it's good to know it clearly, to know that this is sound, but it doesn't mean you use it, right? Right? Like just because you have a stick doesn't mean you beat everyone with it, right? But and حدث الناس على قدر عقولهم, address people according to their intelligence. But this is one of the aspects that and part of of course the other line of that, how does Surah Al-Ikhlas refute Christianity, right? How does Surah Al-Ikhlas refute Christianity? Ibn Juzay talks about this briefly in his tafsir, which is a beautiful tafsir. If you don't have it, if you email me, I can, Omar, or just anybody remind me, I can share the PDF of the Maghribi edition. Do you have it? Anyways, yeah, the PDF. Okay, you can just post it. Tafsir of Ibn Juzay is really nice. It's brief, but Ibn Juzay was a great theologian. He wrote this work, An-Nur al-Mubin fi Aqa'id al-Din. It's a beautiful book, and it's really, really useful. And if something one wants to read on one's own related to Aqidah that's very readable, very clear, and the title, like he connects these proofs that we're looking at with the Quran. And that's really, really that's very, very nice. And in a very clear manner. Ibn Juzay. And he was we can also share the PDF of the Arabic. It's also translated into English, so we'll share that too. We have permission actually from Shaykh Fahim Hussein, the translator, to share that. It's already on the page, alhamdulillah. The English. Both. Mumtaz. But if you can sort of put a plan over X number of months, and it's very imani because he each of these attributes, he connects them to the Quran, etc. It's very enriching, and it's not very technical. It's very readable. And we're at your service if you have any questions about it, but that's a useful complement. There's a much briefer little work by one of the late Malikis, Imam Ilish. They pronounce his name different ways. On the Quranic proofs related to the Aqa'id. And that's also, right? So the second part is وَالدَّلِيلُ عَلَى اسْتِغْنَائِهِ, and Jazakallah khair to Sidi Hamza for sharing something. وَالدَّلِيلُ عَلَى اسْتِغْنَائِهِ عَنِ الْمُتْخَصِّصِ, and the proof that Allah is free of need of a specifier, meaning an originator. And تقول لو احتاج إلى مخصص لكان حادثا, if he needed a specifier, he would be originated. ولو كان حادثا لافتقر إلى محدث, and if he needed an originator, if he were originated, he would need an originator. And how could that be when we have already seen that he is wajib al-wujud, he is the necessary existent. سبق وجوب وجوده وقدمه, and he's necessarily beginningless. وبقائه, and that he's necessarily everlasting, and he's necessarily distinct from originated things. That's why the ulama found that once you look at the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the most powerful way of talking about the existence of God is through wujud. Through wujud. Right? And of course some people and this is sort of being busata, being simpleton, saying, well, Allah doesn't talk about his wujud. Right? So firstly, wujud is that he is, right? He is, which is why the very fact they say قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ, this huwa is his wujud. He is. And that isness is his wujud, is his existence. He is huwa, yeah, and that's it. Which is why because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intriguingly keeps bringing in the damir al-fasl, huwa, right? Which Shaykh Abdullah in some of his work called damir al-wasl, the pronoun of union, huwa, right? That a number of the great imams who wrote on the Asma' Allah al-Husna from the divine names is huwa, he is, right? Amongst them Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi in his Asma' Allah al-Husna, and others. But also throughout the Quran. right? This is clearly understood, that his wujud, because if there weren't that, everything else, there's nothing to talk about, right? And one of the reasons it was not as much of a topic to talk about amongst the earlier scholars is that ilhad, the rejection of belief in God, is an aberration. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks, Afillahi shak? Can there be doubt about God? Because aqlan, it's rationally absurd to doubt about God. Right? Fatir as-samawati, the originator of the heavens and the earth. And He is fatiruha because they need an originator. Right? And then He says wahdaniya, oneness. Right? And now how you talk about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? You could arrange it in another order. The reason they put wahdaniya at the end, why? Because to understand the wahdaniya, what do we mean when we say wa ilahukum ilahun wahid? Your God is but one God. Meaning ilahukum wajibul wujud, right? So they're muqaddimat, right? So there's a tartib في التعقل, right? الإله هو واجب الوجود. The God is, the one God is necessary existent. Wujud, He has wujud. Wujuduhu wajib. He has baqa. He is قديم بلا ابتداء, ancient, yeah, without beginning. He is baqi, دائم بلا انتهاء. He is مخالف للحوادث. Right? He is absolutely distinct from created things. فلا مماثلة بوجه من الأوجه. And He is مستغني. He is absolutely independent. If you understand all of those, He is one. Right? So there's a tartib here. Right? You could, how, they say الترتيب بحسب الاعتبار. Right? How you arrange something is in accordance with your consideration. And so the ulama of mantiq mention that there are 4 principal considerations in order. Some mention there are 6. Some mention more or less. That there's different ways you could order something, and how you do it would depend on context. You can also say that Allah is one because He is the necessary existent. And you could then go into the other. So you say, God is one, right? And then go into the other attributes. That's, for example, how Imam al-Tahawi does it. فنقول في توحيد الله موقنين بتوفيق من الله أن الله واحد. Right? لا شريك له ولا شيء مثله ولا شيء مثله ولا شيء يعجزه ولا إله غيره, etc. Right? So you can arrange it in different ways. But they found this order. There's a tartib في التعقل. There's a rational ordering here, that, and there's a leading us to that affirmation. وَإِلَهُكُمْ إِلَهٌ وَاحِدٌ. That's one of the verses where the great mufassirin, especially the theologians among the mufassirin, frequently, touch upon the discussion on wahdaniyah there. Ibn Juzay does it as well, and others. One of the beautiful things, the ulama do it in general, but Imam Ibn Juzay lays out the roadmap of his tafsir. In the beginning he tells us that he selects his places and he mentions the key mafahim of the deen and where he discusses them in his tafsir, in his introduction. So where he discusses the wahdaniyah, where he discusses mahabba, where he discusses shukr, where he discusses tawakkul. Right? And that's one of the things in different books of tafsir. That's one of the mafatih, that sometimes you go to a verse that's talking about mahabba. And if you don't find the author's talk, because he probably talked about, sometimes it'll come up earlier, sometimes it'll come up later. But now, since we have easier tools, it's good to go back and forth and check where did the author himself explain it, right? Because if every verse they unpacked all its meanings in one place, يعني لنفد البحر, the oceans would be extinguished and they would not be able to explain anything, right? وحدانية, قوله وحدانية, oneness, the commentator says هذه الصفة أهم الصفات, this attribute is the most important of the attributes. ولذا سمي علم التوحيد بها, that's why the science of divine oneness is called the science of divine oneness. ولم يكفر بضدها إلا بعض الناس, and no one denied this, meaning in principle. You ask the Christian, do you believe in one God? They say yes. Right? Actually, even the polytheists, at least in principle, they would say, the learned amongst them say, that what we consider their shirk, it is just shirku taqreeb. And it's the ignorant who have shirku istiqlal. That their shirku of taqreeb, that they worship these things as intermediaries between them and the absolute the supreme being. And whatever names they give the supreme being. But that's still shirk. Right? And there's shirku istiqlal, where you affirm multiple absolute deities. Right? And Imam Sanusi in his Muqaddimat, when he discusses the types of shirk, he goes into these types of shirk. وَلَمْ يَكْفُرْ بِضِدِّهَا, and no one denied this by its opposite, except some people. Except some humans. أَمَّا الْجِنْ بِرُمَّتِهِمْ, as for jinn themselves, فَلَا يَعْتَقِدُونَ الشِّرْكَ لِلَّهِ, they don't affirm shirk for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, subhanahu. وَإِنَّمَا الْكَافِرُ مِنْهُمْ بِغَيْرِ الشِّرْكِ, the jinn who disbelieve don't have shirk. And this, and يعني, they say, إِذَا لَمْ تَرَ الْهِلَالَ فَسَلِّمْ لِقَوْمٍ رَأَوْهُ بِالْأَبْصَارِ. If you don't see the new moon, then some of this is, they take diralat or isharat of certain verses of the Quran. And but this is not a qat'i matter. These are sort of like almost like a fa'idah, right? This is not, right? Like if we took notes, we just say هذه الصفة أهم الصفات لذا سمي علم التوحيد بها. Right? The other is فوائد. وهذه هي الصفة الخامسة من الصفات السلبية. Right? This is the fifth of the negative attributes. وقد نفت كموما خمسة. كموم is a mustalah. It's just plural of kam. So it means multiplicities. You will not find the word kumum in any dictionary. I spent hours and hours and hours and hours looking up all over the place. I went even to this extent, I went down to the local grocery store owners. I lived in a learned neighborhood. Like, alhamdulillah, the grocery store owners in our neighborhood were, so Sahib al-Baqqaliya, Abu Ahmad, is actually Sheikh Mu'min's father-in-law. Right? The guy used to finish the Quran twice a week. This, like, while running his store 11 hours a day, 7 days a week. I knew all the mashayikh, had studied Sharh ibn Aqil, and it was like, he had been attending off and on at least, durus of tafsir with Sheikh al-Qurra, Sheikh Tayyim Rajih for decades. Opposite him was Sheikh Abdul Wakil al-Durubi's grandson. Was not a scholar, but grew up in a Bayt Ilmi. His grandfather, one of the great fuqaha of Damascus. والله سمعان العبارة. I said, we heard this before. But, you know, so kumum is a term, right? One guy said, feel kamoon, تعرف? I was like, no, I don't. So I asked my wife, what is kamoon? She says, cumin. Is it cumin? No. There's no 5 cumins. So it's really, yeah. And that's why sometimes the thing to do is, some things, like you look for it, you don't find, just ask. Right? Kumum is jam'u kam. And they use this terminologically. Right? يعني وقد نفت كموما 5. يعني نفت التعدد. نفت التعدد, multiplicity. Right? So الكم يعني التعدد منفي لذاته وصفاته وأفعاله. Right? And each there's الكم المتصل and الكم المنفصل. So is that صفات أفعال الكم المتصل. Right? فليس ثم ذات فذاته تعالى ليست مركبة. فلا تعدد في ذاته تعالى. There's وحدانية مطلقة في ذاته. أن الكم المنفصل ليس ثم ذات كذاته تعالى. Right? So we negate the multiplicity intrinsically and extrinsically. So Allah's entity itself does not have multiplicity. It's not made up of parts. And there's no entity like the entity of Allah. الكم المتصل في الذات وهو عدم التركيب فيها أو عدم التعدد فيها. That there's no multiplicity in it, i.e. it's not made up of parts. عدم التركيب. والكم المنفصل فيها أي في الذات, and multiplicity, extrinsic multiplicity, وهو عدم النظير أي ليست ثم ذات كذاته تعالى. There's no other entity like the entity of Allah. يعني why? ذاته, and keep in mind those 3 meanings. ذاته واجب الوجود, مطلق, وغني. And والكم المتصل في الصفات. And likewise, his attributes are, we negate the intrinsic multiplicity. وهو عدم التركيب فيها. So Allah's attributes are not made up of parts. So His power does not have a part of His power related to big things and another part related to small things. Why? Because التركيب يقتضي الافتقار. Right? Tarkib entails that each part is in need of the other, is dependent on the other, is not perfect, is not absolute. And all of these are from the characteristics of dependent, originated beings, not the absolute. Subhanahu wa ta'ala. والكم المنفصل فيها وهو عدم النظير. And extrinsic multiplicity in the attributes of Allah, which is that لا يتصف شيء بصفة مثل صفات الله تعالى. That there's nothing that has attributes like the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So all that created things share with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the names of those attributes, not their realities. So we say you have ilm, but you just think about those 3 things. Your ilm is hadith, is muqayyad, is muftaqir. Right? So there's no point of comparison. And then the af'al, right? وَالْكَمُّ الْمُنْفَصِلِ فِي الْأَفْعَالِ. We negate multiplicity in his actions. وَهُوَ عَدَمُ مُشَارِكْ لَهُ فِيهَا. That there is no other actor like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because فِعْلُهُ تَعَالَى الْإِيجَادُ مِنَ الْعَدَمِ. Allah's action is originating from nothingness. Right? And لا خالق إلا الله بهذا الاعتبار. Right? But we affirm أفعال for creation, but not in that, in that sense. We have to make that clear, We affirm af'al, but our af'al are ikhtiyarat. Right? Right? وَالْخَالِقُ هُوَ اللَّهُ. Right? وَالْمُتَّصِلْ فِيهَا لَا يُنْفَى. The كم المتصل, in itself, Allah's actions are numerous, right? Are countless. Right? So the multiplicity of Allah's actions is not negated. لأنه ثابت, because it's affirmed. لأن أفعاله كثيرة على حسب شؤونه في خلقه. Because Allah's actions are numerous in accordance with His affair in His creation. Right? And there's another way of considering that His actions also are one. Right? And Imam Bajuri explained that. Now, what are the af'al of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Now, this is something that is mentioned bahthan. It's not mentioned to people just lightly, because people get confused. Right? And this is, it's like, if a child asks you, the child see a cockroach and say, do you say, did Allah create that? What would you say? Yes. But then do someone, if you're starting a dars, they say, Khaliqul Sarsur? La. Some said it's kufr to say something like that. Right? Because it's not, it's like you introduce someone and say, he goes, this is Zubair. Let me tell you a little about him. For the last 34 years, he's been going to the toilet daily. Right? I mean, you should kick the MC out of the building if they say something like that, right? Because لا يليق, right? So, now the challenge in it, right? It's something that a thinking person, Umar's niece, asked this question, aged, like he was like 4 or 5 years old. Umar was teaching her. I don't know, she was like small, 5 or thereabouts. You don't remember how old she was? 5 or so, right? That, okay, Allah is eternal. She really got this idea. Allah is eternal. But we are created. So how does the eternal create created? Because the created is in time. Allah is not in. So how does that happen? Right? Right? That's, right? And this is one of the philosophers have wondered about that, the theologians have wondered about that, the people of the spiritual. وَعَجَبًا كَيْفَ يَظْهَرُ الْوُجُودُ فِي الْقِدَمِ وكيف يبقى الحادث مع من وصفه القدم أو كما قال. And in his munajat, or in his hikam, Ibn Atiyah says, what an amazement. How does originated being arise out of nothingness? But how does this originated being remain before the one who is absolutely eternal? Right? That's the ubudiyyah. Right? Right? That الأكوان ثابتة بإثباته. Right? Created things are affirmed by His affirmation. ممحوة, absolutely effaced, بأحدية ذاته, before the absolute oneness of His being. So what is this fi'l? Right? So of course, so what is khalq, for example? And part of this is a matter of classification. So Imam al-Ash'ari he said it goes back to the fact that that what is creation right? Imam al-Ash'ari would say, Allah's action goes back to how does something come into existence? There's takhsis, there's specification with Allah's irada, with His will, and there's ijad with His qudra. That's it. That's all there is. Right? So Allah's will specifies what will be, and what Allah's will specifies, Allah's power originates. And we'll look at, this is coming up. We haven't looked at the Sifat al-Ma'ani yet, so we'll look at this. Right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's why they talk about this idea of ta'alluqat, the attachments. Right? So Allah's will potentially can specify anything possible for anything possible for it. And they gave this a terminological name, we'll come to it. It's called ta'alluq as-saluhi al-qadim. Eternally, Allah's power could have originated anything possible, could have specified anything possible with anything possible. We'll come to, don't worry about the terms right now. Potentially. Lillahi fi'lu kulli mumkinin wa tarkuhu. Allah can do anything possible. Yani, fa'alun lima yurid. Right? His irada. But that's in itself. But actually, eternally, there's Allah's will specified some of the possible with some of what is possible for it. That's called a ta'alluq, a tanjizi, the actual relationship of Allah's will eternally. Now, Allah's power eternally could originate anything possible with anything possible for it in accordance with His will, right? But that's eternally. But then, so, and of course this is all just meant to be illustrative, right? So there is power, and then there's created things, right? Where does creation exist? In time, right? So what is creating? Khalq, right? These af'al, right? These af'al of creating, whether you know, khalq, rizq, ihya, imata, all these acts of creating, they relate to what? To the originated, to the hadith, right? But the sifa is what? The sifa is qadiyya. What is the sifa that creates? Qudra. According to Ash'ari, it's qudra. Right? Qudra. The muta'allaq is hadith. What it relates to is the originated. So these ta'alluqat, that's why what Allah actually creates, this ta'alluq, which is the relationship between the attribute and what it relates to, this relationship is manifest what? In time, in huduth, right? So they say the ta'alluq is tanjizi, it's the actual relationship is tanjizi hadith. The actual relationship is originated, meaning it relates to the originated. Right? But the sifa is qadima. Right? So according to Imam al-Ash'ari, all you need is the divine power. These attributes are not really attributes. Right? When we say rizq, what is rizq? Rizq goes back to what? To al-qudra, ما تبرزه قدرة الله تعالى القديمة وفق إرادته القديمة. Right? What is خلق, رزق, إحياء, إماتة? Right? نصف الله سبحانه وتعالى بهذه الأشياء. We describe Allah with these things, so therefore we say they are sifa. Right? But what sifa do they go back to? What is the sifa itself? المعنى القديم القائم بذاته تعالى, what is it? The eternal meaning is قدرة. The قدرة is قديمة, its تعلقات are حادثة. Why? So these are called صفات الأفعال. So the important thing to appreciate, right? That صفات الأفعال يعني ليست صفات يعني بالمعنى المصطلح, right? They're not attributes. What is the attribute? قدرة. The attribute is قدرة. These are the صفات الأفعال. We can put the صفات الأفعال quote unquote according to Imam al-Ash'ari. These are عبارة عن تعلقات صفة القدرة. So التعلقات are حادثة, لأن ما تعلق بالحادث يكون حادثا. They relate to. So the صفة is قديمة. This relationship between the قديم and the حادث, this is the تعلق, right? And what is خلق, which is يعني خلق, رزق, إحياء, إماتة, all these things, the تعلق is حادث, but the صفة is the صفة itself is قديمة, which is the قدرة of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So that's what he is meant. هذا على مختار الأشعري رحمه الله من أن صفات الأفعال حادثة. The صفات of أفعال are originated. Right? Right? And the footnote is quite good. Right? That, you know, right? So that all these meanings, and the quote from al-Baqillani is good, yeah, that Allah describes himself, that he is ana khaliq, ana raziq, ana adil, ana muhsin, right? And all of these صفات الأفعال, these are all كلها راجعة إلى صفة القدرة. That's right. So Omar, we can do a quick diagram of this. Just to there. The cup. Okay. So you have, right? We'll do it in Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, right? This is only for illustrative purposes, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mustaghni an, right? So that you have al-Qudra. You guys can see this, right? This is Qadima, right? Then you have يعني المخلوق, right? الحادث, right? Right? And then there is this relationship. This is the تعلق, right? What it relates to. So sifa is qadima, right? This تعلق. So according to the Ash'ira, this تعلق, this will be called خلق, رزق, ihya, imata, right, etc. Right? So these, the names for these ta'alluq, so insofar as it relates to creating, you say he created. But what is creation? Creation is takhsis wa ijad, is specification. How did khalq, what is khalq? Khalq is what Allah specified with His will, originated by His power. But the makhluq is hadith. And this avoids the ishkal that how can the sifa be qadeem with a muta'allaq that's hadith? Because ma ta'allaqa bil hadith hadith. So they said no, that the sifa itself is qudra. When إذا تعلق بالمخلوق على وجه الخلق يسمى يعني خلقا على الرزق, he say, والرازق, etc. So these صفات الأفعال, what are they? يعني صفات الأفعال, the attributes of action, they're not صفات حقيقية, right? What are they? They're عبارة عن التعلق التنجيزي الحادث لصفة القدرة, right? They are simply the صفات الأفعال, according to Ash'aris, are simply the relationship, right? The ta'alluq, the relationship, the effective, originated relationship of the eternal attribute of power, right? So they called, so for them the صفات الأفعال are this ta'alluq. Right? Now, so you have this, right? Now, the Maturidis looked at the same thing, right? In al-Maturidiyya, right? They said you have so they played a few. They did. All right. So they just, so they looked at, what the Ash'aris call the potential. Right? So they, so here what the Ash'aris refer to as, there's Saluhi and Tanjizi, right? That the divine attribute of power has a potential relationship and an effective relationship. So they said they're two separate attributes. The Qudra, they understood as being ability, right? Ability. And the actual relating, they say this is an eternal quality Allah has called takween. So you just talk about Allah's attribute of power, the Ash'aris call power, they say there's ability and power, right? And there's textual basis for looking at it in this way. So if takween is an eternal attribute, to which all these relationships, these ta'alluqat go back to. So we are saying that, so the ta'alluqat, which is rizq, ihya, etc., go back to that. So what are the attributes? The attributes is what you call Allah when He has this ta'alluq. So the sifa of the fi'l is here. So it's eternal, because it goes back to His eternal capacity for takween, for his eternal power of takween, of takween from kun. For those interested, and this is way beyond our scope, but it doesn't hurt to at least make note of it. There's a treatise by Shaykh Zada, the author, who's Allah is one of those people who Allah blessed with clarity in expression. He has a book explaining the khilaf between the Ash'aris and the Maturidis. He has a brief section on ikhtilaf about this attribute of takween. But the khilaf is in classification. Everybody affirms that there's an eternal attribute and there's a creation, right? And there's a ta'alluq. Now, are you calling the ta'alluq itself the sifat al-af'al? Then they're not actually sifat. The sifa is qudra. Or you say no, there's an eternal attribute called takween, which has many derivative sifat, in the sense that takween, when it relates to creating, eternally you call him khaliq, raziq, etc. And you can see the origins of this in Imam Tahawi's Aqiyah Tahawiyya, right? له معنى الخالق ولا مخلوق، له معنى الرازق ولا مرزوق, etc. So the Maturidis and which are the Hanafis would say, because he has these meanings eternally in this attribute of takween, the Ash'ari would say these are all ibara an ta'alluqat of the sifa of qudra. It's a matter of subtle classification. But nobody disagrees that Allah's actual attributes are eternal, and there's this ta'alluq that's hadith. How do you classify the sifa? Is the sifa just the ta'alluq? Or is it the ascription of that ta'alluq back to the eternal entity of Allah? So it's a matter of classification. أما على الكلام الماتريدية, so he says, as for what the Maturidis say, من أن صفات الأفعال قديمة ترجع لصفة واحدة وهي التكوين، فالكمان معا منفيان أيضا, and both comes with the أفعال متصل منفصل are negated. So this is a matter of classification. Now, you don't have to go into this at all. Like in explaining aqeedah, you don't have to say, right? That Allah's qudra is qadima, وهو الخالق الرازق كذا كذا, خلق يرزق, what he provides is in accordance, يرزق وفق ما خصه بإرادته وأوجده بقدرته. His rizq, his provision is what he eternally specified with his will, and he manifests with his power. You don't have to then go into all of this. Someone asks, all you have to do is to reiterate that Allah Ta'ala qadim wa sifatuhu qadima. Khalas. And you have to say, so we don't really mean that sifat al-af'al are qadima. Someone asks about that. Like we don't have to, متى الساعة ما أعددت لها, right? Like you don't have to answer everything. And they say, okay, بدي تفصيل. Say, okay, go study عقيدة عند أهله. خلاص. You don't have to do more than that. Right? والدليل على ثبوت الوحدانية. Right? So now this is an important investigation. Right? And he breaks this down very nicely. So we'll continue from here بإذن الله تعالى. دليل على ثبوت الوحدانية بمعنى right? So let's just read till the dalil al-naqli, the النقلي. So he says الدليل على ثبوت الوحدانية, the proof of the affirmation of divine oneness, بمعنى عدم النظير في الذات والصفات, that there's no similar to Allah in His entity and His attributes. أما عدم التركيب فتقدم في المخالفة. As for His not being made up of parts, we've taken it in His distinctness. أما عدم المشارك في الأفعال فسيأتي في قوله قدرة بممكن تعلقت. As for having no partner in His actions, it'll come when we say His power relates to all that is possible. أما عدم التركيب في الصفات فسيأتي في قوله ووحدة what is it, Omar? ووحدة أوجب لها. Right? وحدة أوجب لها. Right? And oneness, affirm for it. النقل والعقل. أما النقل فآيات كثيرة. The whole Quran is ناطق بهذا. And the ayat, of course, they're explicit ones where Allah just tells us وإلهكم إله واحد. He says A is B. إلهكم إله واحد. Explicitly. Then Allah tells us about His asma. And He is al-Wahid. Right? And the other names that goes back to Wahdaniyah. There are a number of them. So I will share the page number from Shaykh Abdurrahman Habannaka's work. And there's so many verses, but the whole Quran is not. So some mention explicitly, some by what He affirms for Himself, particularly His names. And then there's other things that He calls upon us to reflect. Right? إن في خلق السماوات والأرض واختلاف الليل والنهار لآيات على إيش؟ على وحدانيته وعليه يعني سبحانه وتعالى. Of course, there's amazing hikmah, because the ayah, of course, an ayah, a sign, is either it points to something, right? Or it manifests something, right? Or it, so there's different levels of indication, right? Right? And the myriad of possibilities in that, right? Ibn Ata'illah in his hikam has a beautiful hikmah of I think 12 negations. كيف يحجبه شيء وهو الذي أظهر كل شيء. How could anything veil Him when He's the one who manifested everything? كيف يحجبه شيء وهو أظهر من كل شيء. How could anything veil Him when He is more manifest than anything? So the ayah, right? There are levels of indication of ayah. One is, for the one who's distant, the ayah is دليل بالشاهد على الغائب. Right? It's pointing from what is they can see to what is absent, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? متى غاب حتى تكون الأكوان يستدل بها عليه. When was He ever absent that originated things are used to point towards Him? Right? وهو معكم أينما كنتم. Right? Right? ليس الحق بمحجوب عنك. The real is not veiled from you. إنما المحجوب أنت. You're the one who is veiled from Him. Right? بحجب الظلم والمعصية والغفلة. Right? Right? And that's why the hikam is sort of a book in aqidah. Right? كيف يشرق قلب صور الأكوان منطبعة في مرآته. How can a heart be illumined when the forms of created things are imprinted in its mirror? أم كيف يرحل إلى الله وهو مكبل بشهواته. Or how can it journey to Allah when it's tied down, chained down by its desires? Right? وكيف أم كيف يطمع أن يدخل حضرة الله وهو لم يتطهر من جنابة غفلاته. How can one be avid to enter the presence of Allah when one has not fully purified themselves from the major impurity of their heedlessness. كيف يرجو أن يفهم دقائق الأسرار. How can one long to understand subtle spiritual meanings وهو لم يتب من هفواته أو كما قال. I may be getting the order of the last two wrong, but that's the idea, right? وإلهكم إله واحد لا إله إلا هو الله لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم. Allah, there is no God but Him. He is the living, the sustaining. هو الذي يصوركم في الأرحام كيف يشاء. He is the one who fashions you in your wombs as He wills. لا إله إلا هو. There is no God but Him. إلى غير ذلك. أما العقل, as for the rational proof, now he will go into the burhan التمانع, right? And we will continue from this. And we touched upon this a little bit in the lesson on, just in passing, in the Tariq al-Muhammadiyya class. So these are interconnected. We talked, we won't repeat what we said there. The discussion of this in a very non-technical but very profound way by Ibn Juzay in his Nur al-Mubin is very good. Right? أما العقل, so we'll continue, take it from there. And there's an ishkal, right? We're not going to spend a lot of time for it. That there's a double negation here. So there's different madhabs on this. The double negation is for emphasis. It's not an affirmation, that's obvious. But they think through it. What kind of illa is this? It's also significant. Right? Now some of it may seem that the ulama are being picky, but if the reason for preciseness, if you look at all these troublemakers that arise, not just outside the fold of Islam, but from within, there's all kinds of people who come up with all kinds of funny reinterpretations and so on. It all comes from حمل النصوص إلى ما لا تحتمل, is to interpret texts in ways that they cannot be interpreted. That's why the sound understanding of the text, in terms of Arabic, نحو صرف بلاغة, and reason, and then the application of the principles of sound interpretation, which is usul al-fiqh, that all of these are تصون النصوص عن العبث. These shield the texts from, but also that who can interpret, like who are you, right? And then also we don't have to prove the truth to anybody, right? We don't have to prove the truth to anybody, right? That this is the truth, right? And we have to speak with certitude. That's one of the problems of sort of academic thinking, is that it comes with the premise there is no truth. Make your argument, make your case, give your theory, right? This is neither a case nor a theory. This is al-haqq al-mubin, right? And we have to have clarity and certitude about that. So we'll look at this, this dalil al-aqli, right? وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم. Any questions? Yeah, so the mabhath al-ta'alluqat will be coming, right? So so it depends which attribute, right? So, but one of the reasons they did this is to understand what is the relationship between the eternal and the originated, right? So some attributes only have, Some attributes have no ta'alluq, which is life. Some have one, which is knowledge. Ta'alluq tanjizi qadim. Allah's knowledge actually relates to all the possible, all the necessary possible and impossible, actually. Right? There's others that have two relationships. Saluhi qadim and a tanjizi qadim, like irada, or saluhi qadim, tanjizi hadith, like qudra, right? And so on. We'll look at the others. Allah's irada, Allah's sam' and basar relate to what? Yeah. Right? There's discussion on that. We'll be coming to it. Right? The ta'alluq of kalam is like same as the ta'alluq of ilm. Are you sure? What is the ta'alluq of kalam? What is it? It says in Jawhara al-Tawhid. Okay, so there's two separate. Okay, the kalam relates to the necessary, possible, and impossible. How many ta'alluqat does it have with it? Okay, so that's. I'm just provoking guys to test you, review diligently. Okay, so we'll be starting the next class in 5 minutes, but just review quickly. Okay, it's not a murder mystery. It's right there in Sawi on the Jawhara. What? Okay.
What's the difference between dawat and ihsan and sifat and af'al, and where can we read about this further?
Don't read about this further, because most places you're going to read will take you on journeys that you wish you'd never taken, right? So forget about science for a second. This is conceptually. Conceptually, there are building blocks of things. That's an essence. Right? That's an essence. It's a unitary conceptual block of something. Right? That's an essence. That's a jawhar. A jirm, a body, ما تركب من جوهرين فأكثر. A body is that which made up of two or more essences. Conceptually, forget, we're not talking about science or matter or anything like that. This is a conceptual classification. Right? Arad is a quality of an essence. Arad is a quality that is possessed by a jawhar. Right? It's called arad because it comes and goes. Right? Al-makan, they have this expression, al-tahayyuz, just taking space. التحيز is أخذ الجرم قدرا من الفراغ الموهوم. And they discuss a lot about al-mawhum. Is there faragh or not? Right? Because if they were absolute, how can something be empty? Right? So say, but faragh al-mawhum, this imagined emptiness. But then of course there's the issue that, okay, if something took the space, then where did the faragh go? Okay? So what's the nature of emptiness? That they thought about it, right? But it doesn't, that's just a way of, this is a conception, this is a rational conception of reality. How we express it then in observed science, right? That's normative. And that's based on classification, right? And that's the majal of al-tabi'a, of nature and observed science, etc. Okay.
Imam Sawi says three.
Which are?
تنجيزي قديم صلوحي قديم تنجيزي حديث.
Okay.
So he says تنجيزي قديم وهو تعلقه بذات الله وصفاته المستحيلات وأخبار الكائنات قبل وجودها. And صلوحي قديم وهو صلاحيته لخطاب من لم يوجد. And التنجيزي حادث وهو خطابه بالفعل لمن وجد.
Right. So what's the relationship between kalam and ilm in terms of ta'alluq? Each relates to three things: the wajib, jaiz, and mustahil. Correct? How they relate to them, ilm has one relationship. Kalam has how many? Yeah. There's kalam about it, but on what most of the mutakhima, there's three. Right? And we'll be coming to that, so don't, or you can just read ahead if you want. There's three. Although generally, the more speculative things here, the ulama tend to say, know it, but some things are بمنزلة الدواء. Like this is how it's, the imams of the science have understood it, but only, you only mention things بقدر الحاجة when it comes to these kinds of things. Because one of the dangers of going into these kinds of nuances, especially في غير محلها, is that someone say, okay, I want to know about Allah. What do I want to know about Allah? The maqsid is, this is what you have, this is what you, هذا إيمانك, then قل آمنت بالله ثم استقم. Okay? Then you want, istiqamah of course is إيمانا, إسلاما وإحسانا, right? It's on all these levels. But istiqamatul iman is not by knowing معلومات عقلية, but by التوجه بالإيمان إلى الله سبحانه وتعالى, what called بتنمية أوصاف الإيمان, right? Right? So that's the harm of sort of getting theological. Although many of the great imams of tasawwuf were great theologians. Actually, most of the great later theologians were all Ahl al-Tasawwuf, right? The people were looking at. That's why one of the reasons the attitudinally divergent brethren get upset. All of these people, Dardir and Sawi and Bajuri and all of them, right, were people of the spiritual path, right? As-Sanusi and everybody right, gets them very upset, right? But so one thing is there's the it's like someone needs to get surgery done, right? Now when surgeons are talking, say, when you cut the patient open, when you do open heart surgery, beware of 7 things. And they have a checklist, 7 things to be careful of when cutting open someone's heart or whatever. But when someone comes, do I need heart surgery? Would you tell them, okay, when you go for surgery, make sure to tell the heart surgeon of those 7 things? No, because they say, oh my God, 7 things they won't go get the heart surgery. Why? Because it's true, but this is not its place. right? Which is why it's very important to observe what is the, what is, like, one is how you study something, then how you convey it is another, right? And that's one of the big fitan of our times. And also many durus, they're not, each thing has its right context, right? And alhamdulillah. So we'll stop.